Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the individuals and do not represent the views and opinions of their current or former or future employers.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
My name is Daniel Kaka.
And my name is Cara Ramos.
We are joined today by a good friend of mine. She's an artist, an animator, has maybe worked on projects that have to do with what we're talking about today.
Maybe just one or two.
She streams on Twitch under the name Hikaronko. Welcome to the podcast, Cara.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
Yeah.
I am very excited to have you on here. Cara is a friend for a while, good friend of Alexa's. Yeah, this is this type of thing where we don't usually, in fact, I don't know if we've ever talked to, well, there's only one other episode where we talked to somebody who had an inside scoop into the production we were talking about.
Yes.
So this is a pretty rare thing for us. I know that you only have so much information and there's only so much that you can talk about as well.
That is correct.
Dan, why don't you go ahead and say what we're talking about today, and then we'll have Cara introduce her connection to this story.
Summer in the city of Arendelle. It couldn't be warmer. It couldn't be sunnier. But that's about to change. Forever.
Arendelle.
It's completely frozen.
Cold, 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 cold.
We are going to be talking about the Snow Queen, but more specifically, the movie Frozen, and just kind of the hurdles that this story had taken until it came to its final project. This is something that we've done multiple times before, where we do talk about movies that do come out, like we talked about Dune. That eventually came out, but there were so many different hurdles that got there. And we're essentially doing the same thing with Frozen.
Or another Disney movie. We did an episode on Empire of the Sun,
Oh.
which of course became Emperor's New Groove.
Yeah, which kind of has similar hurdles. They had a story in mind, and then it just all got scrapped, and then they started over.
Yeah.
The only difference is Sting was not involved.
Yeah, so which means we don't have an amazing, way realer than Disney would want documentary describing what all happened.
Yeah.
Cara, what is your connection to Frozen?
Well, at the time that Frozen was being made, I was actually working as a production assistant in the development department at Disney Feature Animation. I wasn't working specifically on Frozen because it was already in production, but I had been in some of the conversations. It was way before Jennifer Lee Mon became Jennifer Lee Mon. I was working on Moana. We had her in the room a couple of times, potentially as to become a writer on Moana, and we would ask her questions about, hey, how is Frozen doing? And so she would tell us some updates on that. So yeah, I was there in the studio before it got released, and just at the time when everyone was making a mad dash to get the movie done.
Yeah. What does that mean to be in the development team?
The development team is looking at the next 5 movies that are going to come out. So at the time Frozen was being worked on, Moana was in development, Zootopia was in development, and there were a couple of other movies from different directorial teams that they were looking to get greenlit, just because there are so many director teams at Disney. So obviously everybody's just working on, they're doing their research, they're talking about what the story might be, what their characters might look like, and it's super, super preliminary stuff.
People's understanding of the way a lot of films can be made, and certainly this is the way it still is for smaller features and stuff. I feel like the thought process is usually, somebody writes a script, a studio buys that script, and a studio then finds directors to attach to that script and then makes the movie from there. But I know it's definitely not that same case for a lot of studios, especially animation studios and especially Disney. You know, we talked in the past about how Aladdin had the songs written before anything else was created for that movie. How do these projects even start from your experience when you were there, Cara?
Generally speaking, it's the director has an idea. It doesn't have to be a fully fledged idea. It could just be like, I want to tell a story set in Polynesia. And then they're like, okay, well, what kind of stories do Polynesian people tell? What is that culture look like? And this is definitely something that I think mostly began with like the John Lasseter era, where it was like, you have this kernel of an idea, go do some research on it, see what you can find and see what you can expand on.
Gotcha. And it often starts with the director?
It usually starts with the director. Not always, but usually it starts from the director and it's their baby and they carry it to its birth, I guess you could say. Yeah, but they have to put in a lot of work. They have to do the research. They have to figure out their story and their characters. And then they have to present it. And they have to have like a full-on script to present to the bigwigs and be like, what does this look like? What do you think? Do we get greenlit? And a lot of the time, some of those things get shot down. They'll have gone through an entire process and be like, well, this just isn't working for XYZ reason. Either they go back to scratch or they find a way to rework what they have into something that fits better.
Something that I've noticed when I've gone through a lot of Disney animated films is I will never be able to really find a script just because there's so many working parts at the same time during the development level, because the development is also kind of the production as well. So like how much of it is actually being developed and how much of it is animating happening all at the same time?
A lot of the time it spends a good at least a year in development before it gets greenlit and put into production. But even once it's put into production, a lot of stuff gets reworked. They'll have their story and they'll have their script and they'll start storyboarding it. And then they will cut it together into a movie and present it to everybody at the studio. And are like, what do you guys think? And everyone will give their notes. And then based on what those notes look like and their notes from like their executives and stuff, they might have to completely scratch it. They might have to just completely rework just parts of it. It's very fluid, I would say.
Is there anyone that gives like the worst notes? And does that person rhyme with Blatzenberg?
From what I've heard about Mr. Blatzenberg, I've heard that he has given some wild notes. It really depends. It's funny because
he's just such a fun character that we talk about all the time on this podcast. He's one of those recurring, sometimes villain, sometimes just weird nuisance of the entertainment industry.
Yeah. There is, I don't know if you guys have heard this before, but I worked on Moana and I would talk with Ron and John, who worked with Mr. Blatzenberg.
Yeah.
They told me a story once about when they were working on The Little Mermaid. They had Ariel design and, she's how she is. She's a redhead. She has her seashell cups, all that stuff. They were told by their executive, no, mermaids are blonde. And they were like, what a weird, what? Like, who told you this? Where did you hear this? He's like, no, all mermaids are blonde. Everybody knows that. And they were like, what are you talking about?
I want to see Blatzenberg's YouTube comments on that Little Mermaid trailer.
Oh my God, can you imagine? Yeah, stuff like that. It depends. I don't know who gives the worst notes. I've heard my share of strange notes from executives. They would be like, can we make this little thing clear? Like there'd be a plan payoff moment. And like, you want some of those things to be pretty subtle sometimes.
Yeah.
They set a thing down and then they turn, they keep talking. And then the next time they look back at it, it's gone. And usually that's pretty subtle. And you're like, oh no. And I had an executive note once where they were like, can we make that more clear that he put it down? And that's where it was. I'm like, how dumb is the audience that you think they're not going to follow that? I don't understand.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to do in movies is try to catch when there are lines that are obviously ADR'd
Yep.
that the executive said, oh, we need to make this more clear. Whenever somebody says a line that their lips are not the ones on screen, it's showing somebody else's face, and it's like, oh, that's a weird, clunky bit of exposition that clearly was only like recorded way after the fact because some executive was like, people aren't going to realize what this is.
Yeah.
There was a movie I watched last night. I rewatched The Lost City.
Ooh, with Sandra Bullock and Channing Tatum. That's a fun movie.
It's better than it should be.
It is. What the hell?
I remember
Yeah.
that being the reviews I've heard. It was like, it's not the greatest movie ever, but it's really fun and way more fun than
Better than you'd
anybody
think.
would have
Yeah, it's
expected
better
to
than
be.
you
But-
think it was. You go in
Yeah.
with pretty low expectations, and you're like, whoa.
That was actually a good time.
But there's a moment in there where Sandra Bullock, she climbs through this little cave area and then it opens up into like this bigger cave. And there's a moment where she's like rolling on the ground, but there's a clear ADR line that's in there to be like, oh, a big open cave.
Ah.
She's not panting or anything. She's not panicked. She's just like, look at this new place I'm in. So, David, what is your history with Frozen?
I remember watching it when it first came out. Around the time that I had first moved to LA, and I remember it being one of the first movies I saw at the El Capitan Theater, which is Disney's theater on Hollywood Boulevard, which is really fun place to watch movies because they always do extra special effects of stage shows, and there's a live organ player, and they'll do lots of other fun stuff there. And it's a good vibe. I really enjoy that theater. That movie was a phenomenon, and I was definitely one of the people who was on board with like, yeah, this movie's great. I was already kind of like on board with this new era of Disney because I remember when Tangled came out, I loved Tangled. And Tangled is still, I think, one of my favorite Disney movies. It really, really holds up.
Hell yeah.
Frozen, I feel like, has not aged as well for me. I haven't watched it in a little while. Frozen kind of seems like it started a trend that existed with a lot of animation or just studio movies after the fact, but especially with Disney, of this kind of meta, self-referential, not quite fully meta, but there's plot points that are in there that feel very much to be subverting the classic Disney formula. Oh, we're going to have the love at first sight thing, but it turns out to be bad. We're going to flip around what types of relationships we expect. We're going to flip around kind of who we expect to be the protagonist. I know that was the first real surprise Disney villain, which I know lots of people have their opinions on whether or not surprise villains are good or bad.
The twist villain.
Yeah.
So it's something that I feel like the movie hasn't aged as well as something like Tangled. I think Tangled still absolutely holds up, and I think a lot of what made Frozen such a big phenomenon is because of how much of a surprise it was when it came out and how many new things it was doing, and now that has kind of faded a little bit, so it doesn't have quite the same weight. And I think also there's been a bit of a feeling of being a little tired of the poking fun at oneself big studio thing, criticism I heard a lot of people lobby at She-Hulk. It was a really fun show, and I think it was super funny, and it might be my second favorite Disney Plus Marvel thing, but it does a thing at the end where it's like, yeah, you're poking fun at yourself, but also you're still doing the thing. You don't
Yeah.
to be off the hook for saying, oh, look at this dumb thing you're doing, because you're still doing it, guys. Come on. There is a little bit of that element there still in Frozen. That's my Frozen cold take.
Cold take.
Cara, I mean, we kind of know your history with Frozen, but I guess once the final product came out, what was your opinion on it?
When the actual final product came out, I mean, I had seen at least one screening before it came out, and it was pretty close to what it ended up being. Disney hasn't told a lot of sister stories, and I have two older sisters, so that hit pretty close to home to me. So honestly, like that first Do You Want to Build a Snowman, that was like,
That's really special.
that was me when my sisters went to college and I was alone at home.
Oh.
So like Frozen, certainly when it first came out, nobody at the studio expected it to become the insane phenomenon it did.
Yeah.
This was a good movie. I really liked that it told a sister story. I liked that it poked a little fun at the love at first sight, you can't get married to the first guy you meet.
Mhm.
It was a lot of like refreshing ideas that were very new at the time that Disney had never done before. And so that really made it feel fresh and original. And I think you are right in that glow has sort of faded over time, especially as they've made more movies that do similar things.
Yeah. Did not care for Frozen 2.
I know a lot of people who love Frozen 2, and I'm like, it was okay.
Yeah.
Like, I still like the first one better, and I think that is because I still come in with that, like, this was the first time Disney really did poke fun at itself, and not in a mean-spirited way, and just like, this is historically what we've done, and we know the criticism. It's funny. It was kind of that, and that was fun. Over time, and as it got everywhere, and as like merchandise was everywhere, and it was on every Pringles can in the convenience store, I started being like, stop following me around.
Because everywhere you go, you're reminded
Everywhere.
of work.
Yeah. I went to Tokyo that year, and I was like, Anna and Elsa are here. What the hell's going on? I do agree it's not as timeless and evergreen as like Tangled is, because I adore Tangled.
Tangles is incredible.
Beautiful
Love that
fucking movie. Yeah, I haven't seen Frozen in a bit, and it is one of those things, like, I haven't thought about it, but like, yeah, it's not one of those movies that like I would watch over and over and over again.
Yeah.
I watched Tangled like 7 times in the theater. I did not feel that compulsion for Frozen. I really liked it, and I think the music is amazing.
I think it's probably got the best music of any of the 3D Disney era. Granted, there's not a lot of other competition. Do You Want to Build a Snowman is still like S tier music. It's great.
The music in the sequel is also phenomenal.
That's one reason why my opinion of Frozen 2 might not be valid, is because the one time I saw it, there was something wrong with the sound system in my theater. So during all of the songs, the vocal track was like 50% quieter than the music, so I couldn't hear what people were singing most of the time.
No, that's horrible. The music is the best.
My opinion of Frozen 2 might be a little low because I had a bad experience.
Oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. The music is easily my favorite part of Frozen 2. The story's fine. The music was great.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever had this where it's like you're sitting in a theater and you're like, I feel like something is wrong, but I'm not quite sure and I can't quite put my finger on it. And then by the second song, I'm like, okay, definitely the vocals are too quiet. I should be able to hear what somebody is singing over the strings right now.
That is true. Oh my God, that sucks.
Dan, what are your thoughts on Frozen?
It took me a while to get on the Frozen train. I think part of it was that the marketing for Frozen was like, this is a movie for little girls. And as a guy in his mid-20s, I definitely felt like this was not a film for me. So I didn't see it in theaters. I eventually got on board and watched it. And like I said, the tropes of classical Disney fairy tales being thrown on their heads and the twist villain at the end, I think that's what brought me to really liking this movie and seeing the value in like, oh, this is actually really great. And in doing the research and looking into the original story, I was like, they definitely created a story that's much better than the original.
It's another thing that I think made Frozen stick out. It seems like one of the fundamental changes that they made is the realization of making it a more empowering feminist story with Elsa's character as opposed to the typical Disney villain route that they could have gone.
No, I agree. It did kind of feel like testing the waters. And so now that they've tested the waters, everybody has sort of come out with stories that expand on that same sort of feeling.
It doesn't feel quite as cheap as She's Got Help in Endgame,
Yeah.
but it's closer to that level.
So I think we can start getting into the notes.
Let's go.
We're going to actually talk about the Snow Queen.
All right.
So the Snow Queen, it was originally published in December 1844 as part of the second collection of the first volume of the New Fairy Tales, all written by Hans Christian Andersen. In Danish, the original language that it was written in, the story was titled... Oh boy.
Good luck.
Snedronigen. We're going to hear about that. So, Hans Christian Andersen wrote a total of 156 stories, A few of his other famous titles include The Emperor's New Clothes, The Little Mermaid, The Princess and the Pea, The Ugly Duckling, and Thumbelina.
It wasn't until fairly recently that I realized that Hans Christian Andersen was alive in the 1800s. I thought that these fairy tales were like 1,000 years old type of a thing, and that it was these stories that had existed in oral history for a while, and that Hans Christian Andersen was like Homer, the old author from generations ago. It's weird to me to think that Hans Christian Andersen was a contemporary of Mark Twain. That does not line up in my head. It feels like entirely different eras.
Yeah, it was like Disney was waiting until the copyright laws were lifted on all of his stories, and we're like, there,
Right.
done.
It's also weird to think about how much of film history, especially early film history, was built on adapting books that had just gone into the public domain. You know, that's where we get things like Frankenstein. And there's a lot of books written in the 1800s that became very famous movies because they were copyright free now. But
Yeah.
it's still current enough that people were familiar with the ideas.
And that's why It's a Wonderful Life is a staple Christmas movie, even though it's not really about Christmas. It's more about baking.
It's true, isn't it?
Now, I'm not going to go fully into the history of Hans Christian Andersen just because I don't think that's fully relevant to the story, but I do want to share an interesting story that I found that reveals the type of person and character that he is. So apparently Hans was insufferable to be around, and it was difficult for him to find anyone to love and even find a friend. There was an account where Hans met Charles Dickens at a party in the summer of 1847. Hans was not well known in England yet. His stories were all in Danish, and they were in the process of being translated to English. But Charles Dickens was very well known, and Hans was just fangirling over him. They had a great conversation, and a few weeks later, Dickens sent Hans a package with his books and a personal note. For the next 9 years, they exchanged letters, but Dickens grew more and more annoyed by him. And insincerely, and kind of as a joke, Dickens said in a letter that if he were ever to come back to England, that he should visit him and stay in his house, thinking that Hans would never take up the offer. But he did. In June of 1857, Hans showed up at the doorstep of Dickens' home in Higham, stating in a letter just before arriving that he'll be there for no more than 2 weeks. Dickens and his family were not prepared for what was going to happen next. Hans was socially awkward, had a hard time picking up on social cues, and made sure that he was the center of attention. Just a few examples of how he would act. Hans would request Dickens' son to shave his face daily, stating that it was a custom for male hosts in Denmark to do so. Dickens instead made daily appointments for Hans at a nearby barbershop.
This is like the whole, like, people in Sweden don't feed you dinner or something.
Yes,
like, it's
yeah.
just like, what? Is that really a custom, Hans?
I don't think so. I think he just made that up.
Oh my God.
Amazing.
Before entering the dining hall, Dickens presented out his arm to a woman to walk in with him. Usually it would be his wife. But instead, Hans jumped at the opportunity, and Hans and Dickens, linked arm in arm, walked in together instead. On top of this, Hans didn't stay for 2 weeks. Instead, he stayed for 5 very long weeks. Around the time Hans was staying with them, Charles Dickens was the lead in the play The Frozen Deep. Hans attended the premiere, where he was heard loudly weeping in the crowd. Queen Victoria was apparently in the crowd during this show. In another account, one of Hans' stories received a negative review, and he passionately wept on Dickens' front lawn. When guests came to visit Dickens, he would have to warn them, stating, quote, Hans Christian Andersen may perhaps be with us, but don't mind him, especially as he speaks no language but his own, Danish, and is suspected of not even knowing that.
What?
Wow.
Yeah.
Everybody hated Hans Christian Andersen.
Wow.
Yeah. Andersen was also known for his crafting, which were usually just paper cutouts, but typically he would leave a huge mess for someone else to clean. He did this in Dickens' house. Didn't even clean up after himself.
Where
Oh
is
my
this movie?
God.
Give me a Dickens and Andersen movie. This is incredible.
I would love to see that movie. That's hilarious.
I found this story and I was like, yes, it's so juicy. There is a speculation that Dickens based the David Copperfield character Uriah Heep on Hans Christian Andersen.
Can you give like a description of who that character is for somebody like me who may not be familiar with David Copperfield?
Let's see, fictional character, primarily the antagonist in David Copperfield. Basically, he just seems to be unaware of anything that's happening around him.
Oh, God.
Yeah, and is just annoying beyond belief. For Hans Christian Andersen, he didn't see himself that way. Instead, he actually saw himself more as the ugly duckling, which he kind of assumed as that was himself in the story of the ugly duckling.
Oh my gosh.
I mean...
Yep. So Hans' behavior might be attributed to his upbringing in the country and his paranoia of the big cities. He was always afraid to be pickpocketed, and one time a cab driver needed to take an alternate route, and Hans was convinced immediately that he was going to be robbed and killed. So he proceeded to shove all of his belongings in his boots. After Hans left, Dickens wrote a note in his guest room for future guests to read that read, Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages.
Oh my God.
Hans Christian Andersen, an insufferable human being.
So while you were talking, I was doing other research. Did you find information about the inspiration of the Snow Queen specifically, Dan?
I actually have.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
good.
that was kind of my lead-in back into the Snow Queen because according to the biographer Cara Ramos, the story was inspired by Hans' experience with Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind. So they met in 1840 and he fell madly in love with her. But she was not interested in him romantically because no one was interested in him romantically. He then wrote a story about an icy-hearted snow queen after Jenny rejected his offer to be a suitor.
Just looking at this other stuff, I was reading a couple of things while you were talking there, Dan, and it seems like this was also not the first time that Hans Christian Andersen got obsessed with somebody and professed his love for them, and they rejected him, and
then he wrote a story about it.
And he was being a creepy weirdo, and he's like, I'm just an ugly duckling, but one day I'll be a beautiful swan. Apparently, in his letter of professing his feelings to her, like in Jenny Lind's response to him, she ended it with your affectionate sister, Jenny Lind, which is just like, oh.
Sibling zone.
Oh, boy.
And then he writes the Snow Queen? I'm sorry, this guy is like ultimate weirdo incel dude.
Yeah. Have any of you two really read The Snow Queen?
No.
Really read it? No. I know it. I've seen some mini animated versions that talk about the sort of general story. So I know how it begins and ends, but I haven't actually read it, no.
I don't think I even know it at all, other than Frozen.
I was in the same boat going into this, and I was like, I really don't know the Snow Queen. And it's kind of like when you go into the original Grimm's fairy tales, and you're like, holy shit, this is much darker than I expected it to be. I did not expect the evil stepmom to like have to dance in iron shoes until her feet melted.
Yeah.
It's one of those situations where you're like, oh, the source material is definitely interesting. So I managed to actually make kind of a summary of what the Snow Queen story is. The devil has created a magic mirror that magnifies people's bad qualities and ugly aspects. The devil, who is the headmaster of a troll school, takes the mirror and his pupils around the world to show the people their flaws. They bring the mirror to heaven, in which they will show the flaws to angels and God. But in their attempt, the mirror slips and falls to earth, and it shatters into billions of pieces. The broken pieces, some of the size of the grain of sand, blow in the wind and get into people's eyes and hearts. Those with the shards in their eyes see the worst in people, while the shards that get into the person's heart will turn that heart into a block of ice. Years later, we are introduced to the little boy Kai and a little girl Gerda, who lived next door to each other. The two lived in large buildings that were so close to each other that they could easily step from one rooftop to another. The two have been friends since they were young, and they were as close as siblings. Kai's grandmother informs the children of the Snow Queen, the ruler of the snow bees.
Of the snow bees?
The snow bees.
Bees?
Beets?
Bees?
Beans.
Like buzz, I collect honeybees, or like snow bees, like, oh, they're Snow people.
It's another name for snowflakes,
Oh.
but he refers to them as snow bees in the story.
Okay.
The snowflakes, or the snow bees, they gather around the Snow Queen the most. One night, Kai sees the Snow Queen outside of his window, and he draws back in fear. Spring has arrived, and the roses are blooming. Gerda has learned a song that she sings to Kai. In the summer, a mirror shard gets into the heart and the eye of Kai. He destroys the rose garden and is cruel to his grandmother and Gerda. The only beauty he sees is in snowflakes, or snow bees.
Sorry, I cannot get over calling them snow bees.
I'm going to call it that from now on.
Snow bees.
Snow bees.
Well, if you think about it, if you think about hail, if you don't have a word for hail and you're just like, oh, those are like
because they sting
round
when they
pieces
hit
of
you.
ice. Yeah. So that might be the origin of that. Who knows? Speculating. Winter rolls around and Kai goes out to play. He spots a mysterious white sleigh carriage driven around by the Snow Queen and attaches his sleigh to her carriage for fun. When he gets out of the city, the Snow Queen reveals herself, and she's the most beautiful woman Kai has ever seen. She kisses Kai 2 times, the first to numb him from the cold, the second to forget Gerda and his family, but the third kiss would kill him, but she does not kiss him a third time. The Snow Queen takes Kai to her palace. The people in the city assume that Kai had died in the river.
By the way, this is very much reminding me of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with, what's his name, Mr. Turkish Delight Kid.
I was just thinking that. I think, isn't she supposed to be inspired by the original Snow Queen?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's evil ice lady ruler.
Yep. Luring children to their deaths.
Yep.
So the next summer, a heartbroken Gerda goes out looking for answers to Kai's death. While she mourned for him for months, every time she cried out, the sun and the birds would sing to her saying that he was still alive. She goes to the river and offers her red shoes in exchange for Kai. The river denies the offer and informs Gerda that Kai did not drown. She gets in a boat and the river leads her in the right path. Gerda visits an old sorceress with a beautiful garden of eternal summer. The sorceress wants Gerda to stay with her forever, so she sinks the garden beneath the earth so that no flowers would remind Gerda of Kai, in the hopes that she forgets him. The sorceress forgets about the rose that she put in her hat, which immediately snaps Gerda out of her trance and remembers Kai. She begins to cry, and her tears raise a bush out of the ground. The bush can see all the dead under the earth, tells Gerda that Kai is not dead. She asks the other flowers about Kai, but they all sing to her, not helping her at all. Gerda exits the garden to realize it's autumn and she's not prepared for the cold. Next, she meets a crow, who informs her of a prince that seems to act like Kai and is in the princess's palace. She goes to the palace and meets with the prince and the princess. The prince, unfortunately, is not Kai. She tells her story and they provide her with warm clothes, food, and a golden coach with a crew. While traveling in the coach, she's captured by robbers. They kill the crew, but they spare her life by the request of the bandit leader's daughter, and they bring her to their castle, because robbers are notorious for having their own castles.
Yeah, totally.
She befriends the robber girl, and her pet doves tell her, Gerda, that they saw Kai when he was taken by the Snow Queen towards Lapland. A reindeer named Bay says he knows how to get to Lapland since it's his home. Gerda and the reindeer travel north to the Snow Queen's palace. They stop at the Lap woman's home, and she tells them to go to the Finn woman's home. Don't know what that means, but that's part of the story. The Finn woman informs the reindeer of the mirror shards that have infected Kai, and of Gerda's secret power that will save Kai, stemming from her pure innocence and how everyone wants to help her. Gerda and Bay make to the outskirts of the Snow Queen's palace. Bay runs back, leaving Gerda to fend for herself. The snowflake guards prevent her from entering, so she prays the Lord's Prayer. Her breath takes the shape of angels, and they fight off the guards. Gerda enters the palace. Gerda finds Kai on a frozen lake called the Mirror of Reason, where the Queen's throne is located. Kai is tasked with using splinters of ice to spell a word the Queen has given to him. When he's done, he'll be released of her spell and given a pair of skates so that he may get home. Gerda runs up to Kai and kisses him. Her warm tears melt his heart. Kai bursts into tears, which removes the shards from his eyes. Kai remembers Gerda, and his personality instantly changes to the kind person he was before. The two dance, and the splinters of ice dance with them. When they stop, the splinters fall and spell the word eternity. The reindeer returns with another reindeer, and the two ride back to the robber's palace. From there, they walk home. When they arrive back home, the two are now fully grown, and it's summertime. The last passage of the story is the grandmother reading a Bible verse. Quote, "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 18:3. So yeah, that is the Snow Queen.
So I think one of the reasons why it always surprises me to hear Hans Christian Andersen was like a contemporary of Charles Dickens. Granted, saying this based off of a summary, and maybe things also get lost in translation, but it seems like Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales are often just a bunch of random series of events and less about a thing that goes through them. You know, when you're adapting a Hans Christian Andersen story, as, you know, Disney has done a bunch of times, you can take a bunch of different scenes and do completely different things with them. You can change up the characters totally. You can change up the theme and still call it the same thing because it's still close enough because it's got a couple of these random scenes. Mm-hmm. You can't really do that with a Charles Dickens novel. If you're adapting a Charles Dickens novel, the characters, the setting, the plot, the theme, they all are connected in a way that you can't really change one too much without changing everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And hearing a summary of a Hans Christian Andersen story, and I'm like, all right, I guess it's just like
And then this happened.
a bunch of stuff
And then
happening.
this happened.
Oh, I guess
And
at
then
the
this
end, it's
happened.
all about you're trying to be like kids, I guess.
Yep,
Yeah.
she
All
went
right.
over here and this happened, and then she went over here and this happened, and she went over here and she finally achieved her goal, and then she went home.
I mean, I guess there is like something to it of trying to like be about return to childhood innocence and corrupting childhood innocence and that type of a thing. But the events that happen don't really tie in super well with the theme of the story at the end.
It was one of the two, like, older women that she met along the way, but to say like, oh yeah, Kai has powers, and you're just like, could we not mention that in the first act? Like, he just mentioned that, like, oh yeah, there's an extra thing that she has that's gonna make this all be better in the end.
Yeah.
And it's just like the page before the story actually ends. So that's the story summary. We can probably kind of see why Disney is like, I don't know how we can really interpret that and make it a good story, but
Yeah. But then again, you know, Disney does this all the time. They take loose ideas and form them into something totally different, but still like similar enough, you know? So most of Disney's adaptations of things is not really that close to what it's adapting. A lot of their movies are doing totally different things with the source material. I mean, I could be wrong, but like Hunchback of Notre Dame is nothing like the original intention of the story, you
No,
know?
not at all.
Moana is taking different pieces of different legends and combining them together into something totally different. Like, that's what Disney does, is they don't do the straight adaptation very often.
except for Call of the Wild.
Well, I mean, even like Disney animation, like, is there a Disney animated thing that is like super similar to the original source material? I feel like based off of what I've heard, Beauty and the Beast might be like the most that's closest to. Actually, you know what? Forget it. I already know the answer to this question. The answer is Treasure Planet. Treasure Planet is probably the closest to the original source material of all of their movies. Granted, it's a different setting, but it's got all the same characters, the same story beats, like all of the same ideas. It's basically a scene-for-scene recreation of Treasure Island.
That is pretty true. I mean, would you argue that like even Snow White is like extremely dissimilar from the original?
I don't know anything about Snow White.
It is a grim story, and grim stories tend to be extremely bloody.
That's true.
But
Yeah. The evil queen did die at the end of
She did.
of Snow White, right?
thrown off a cliff by the dwarves.
Was it the dwarves or the
It
huntsmen?
was the dwarves. The dwarves like chased her up a cliff, and then she tried to kill them with like a
right.
boulder.
Yes, they did. Yes.
And then like lightning struck the ledge she was on, and she fell to her death.
Yeah. I remember this from
Thus beginning
dark
a
ride.
series of villains falling to their death in Disney movies.
That's an interesting question to bring up, and I'm going to start looking into that.
Yeah. I mean, like, even if you go for something that's based off of something super contemporary, you got Big Hero 6 is also, like...
Extremely different, yes.
Doing a totally different thing than the source material it's based off of.
I guess taking that formula and kind of applying it to superhero movies, that's kind of what you're doing, where you have
Yeah,
true.
That's 100% what they're doing.
so many like different scenes and things to pull from and be like, oh, we can take so many different elements and then make our own story from that.
Yeah. Which is something that I enjoy about a lot of superhero stuff, especially now that I'm like reading comics of like, oh, I see now how like this story influenced this one part of that movie and like how it used this a little bit from over here and a little bit from over there and a little bit from over there.
Yeah. To go back to the Snow Queen a little bit, it is interesting to hear the beats of the story and like, oh, okay, so they take the shards of the mirror as like the ice powers affecting Anna's head and heart. They kept that little bit. The trolls was still an element that they kept as well. It's interesting to see, what little pieces they kept to help them create a more coherent story.
Yeah. To continue into the notes, the Snow Queen is undoubtedly a popular story. It's been adapted into plays, television specials, movies, musicals, dance interpretations, operas, and even video games.
There's a Snow Queen video game?
I'm sure there's several.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to think of maybe I should go through each interpretation, but seeing the list of it was like looking at a voice actor's IMDb, and I was like, we're going to be here all day. So I'm not going to do that. But specifically, I want to go down one story about the Snow Queen interpretation. And I wanted to mention that Walt Disney was interested in making his own version of the Snow Queen. So this is like the Walt Disney, like the Walt Disney Company, like the Walt Disney. He wanted to make his own version of the Snow Queen.
Wow. So the What Would Walt Have Done era lasted all the way to 2013?
Yeah. Some say it's still going.
Yeah, I know the Snow Queen has been sitting on their shelves for a long time before Frozen came out.
Yeah. Disney has turned to Hans Christian Andersen for many of their stories. There was the 1934 short, The China Shop, which was based on The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep, and the 1939 award-winning short, The Ugly Duckling. There was the 1944 book, Through the Picture Frame, from Walt Disney's Little Library, based on Oli Loki, I think is what it is. In the mid-1930s, producer Samuel Goldwyn came up with the idea of making a movie all about Hans Christian Andersen, and it would feature many of his stories sprinkled throughout the film.
Oh, like buying them together in something? We're going to do a Shrek, but just of Hans Christian Andersen stories?
The best of Hans Christian Andersen.
Yeah.
League of Extraordinary Andersons?
Around this time, Walt Disney animation artists were trying to develop the Snow Queen, but then Disney caught on of Goldwyn's movie and proposed that all the fairy tales should be animated by Disney Studios and the live action scenes would be filmed by Samuel Goldwyn Productions. The collaborative film went into development in the early to mid 1940s.
Sounds more like it would have been sort of a biopic, but then with sequences depicting the
stories.
Yeah.
It sounds almost like this movie called Mishima that's like about this Japanese poet. The movie has scenes of like the actual poet in like one event of his life, but then it also has like dramatic recreations of his stories, and that actually creates the bulk of the movie, and the biopic part is actually like a pretty small chunk of it.
Yeah, so it had been Hans Christian Andersen just kind of hanging out around Copenhagen, and then once the children come by and is like, let me tell you a tale, and then it would have like cross-dissolved into an animated story about whatever he was talking about. Ugly Duckling, Thumbelina, whatever it was.
And then there is this other woman who rejected me. That reminds me of another story that I wrote. That's what the whole movie would have been.
Let me tell you a tale of a broken heart.
Just literally every like sequence of the movie is just like somebody being creeped out by him, and then a story that he wrote of like, well, here's how I'm actually the hero and I'm the victim here for making Mark Twain's child shave my face. Hans Christian Andersen, you weirdo.
Charles Dickinson.
No, sorry. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry.
Mark Twain is Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens,
son.
you know, it's...
But
honestly, what's Charles Dickens if not the British Mark Twain?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Hot take.
I don't know enough about literary anything for that to mean anything.
I also suspect that Charles Dickens was not the easiest person to be around either.
That is probably true. They were probably both pretty insufferable in their own ways.
And they were just two heads butting at each other, and nothing good was going to happen from that.
No.
So, unfortunately, the production on Disney's end halted when the U.S. entered World War II, and the studio started making propaganda films to help the studio from shutting down. The project was shelved during the war, and the collaboration between Goldwyn and Disney ended. Samuel Goldwyn Productions eventually picked up the movie again and produced the film Hans Christian Andersen, starring Danny Kaye as the author, which was released in 1952.
Danny Kaye?
Yeah.
I don't know if I know who.
You know, White Christmas?
Oh, okay. Not Daniel Kaka.
No.
No, different Danny Kaye.
Kaye. The fairy tales that were originally going to be animated were replaced with music numbers instead, and none of them featured the story The Snow Queen. I actually did watch this movie last night, and there's a moment where he falls in love with a ballet dancer who is married, and basically the bulk of the film is about him pursuing that woman.
Oh my gosh.
Danny Kaye, he is a charismatic person. If you've ever watched White Christmas, like, he is a very charismatic person. And they tried to make Hans Christian Andersen seem like a wonderful person to be around. But there are so many scenarios where you realize, oh, he's actually terrible.
He's the creep.
You don't
And
get
they-
it.
it's
He's
almost
a nice
unavoidable.
guy. Why do nice guys always finish last?
There's a moment in there where he witnesses the ballerina dancer and her husband get in an argument, and the husband actually like slaps her, and he was just so distraught by this, and he's like, that's not right. And he ends up writing The Little Mermaid in response to this and sends The Little Mermaid tale to her to read. Yeah.
How did you come to write that story for me?
How else could I tell you how I felt? That I knew how miserable you were with him.
Miserable? With my husband?
Yes, I don't think you knew I was there, but I saw the way he treated you. I saw him slap you. I heard you cry.
Oh, Hans.
How else could a cobbler speak to you?
But really, she's living the little tin soldier life where she's the ballerina.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
he's the soldier that's going to save her from the evil clown Jack-in-the-Box guy.
Yeah. In the movie, he's a cobbler that turns into a writer eventually, but like he makes all of these ballet shoes for the dancer, and he wants to give it to her before the play starts, which they actually made an interpretation of The Little Mermaid into a ballet.
Whoa.
And he goes to the play. He's like, I just want to give these to her. The director of this play, he's like, no, you can't do that, and locks him in the prop room
What?
for the entirety, not just the play, but he forgets about him and he has to stay there overnight.
Wow.
Jeez.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't know if I'd recommend watching it. Maybe watch it at 1.5 speed. So yeah, that collaboration ended, especially after that movie came out. Disney would attempt to adapt The Snow Queen again in the early 1970s, and this time as a dark ride at Disneyland.
Oh.
Yeah, Imagineer Mark Davis created a design for the Enchanted Snow Palace that would have been located at the Fantasyland Theater today.
It's weird to think of a ride that they're making that's based off of somebody else's like book and not either an original story like a lot of those early rides or based off of their own property.
Yeah, the movie that they did about that. Yeah.
Yeah, nowadays everything that Disney makes is based off of their own properties. I feel like in early days as Disneyland, it would have been like their own original stories and ideas. It's so bizarre to think, oh, we really want to adapt the Snow Queen. We can't make the movie work. Let's turn it into a ride.
Which I guess with Pirates of the Caribbean, that was a lot of like Errol Flynn swashbuckling pirate movies.
Yes.
But that's like based off of a genre. That's
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
doing
yeah.
our own version of a genre, not a specific story.
Yeah.
And then Tomorrowland being a whole series of the futuristic world of 1985.
Yeah.
I thought that came out of the World's Fair.
I think
Oh,
so.
yeah.
And then they expanded on it
Yeah.
for Tomorrowland.
The only thing I can think of that's sort of like that is, and I think it's in Disneyland Paris, their Tomorrowland. They had some stuff that I think was based off of Georges Méliès movies, but there was some other author, the name is escaping me now, that was like the inspiration for like the design aesthetics. It wasn't necessarily Georges Méliès. It was whatever Georges Méliès was basing his stuff off of, like with A Trip to the Moon back in the early days of film.
Yeah.
They were trying to do their Tomorrowland as this is 100 years ago's version of what they thought the future would be, to make it a more timeless version of Tomorrowland, which honestly I think is kind of genius, because if you make it our current view of what tomorrow's going to look like, that's going to be outdated in 10 years.
Yeah.
But if you do a specific idea of what the future could be.
Wait, Jules Verne?
You were correct. It was Jules Verne.
Oh, okay.
That was the inspiration for a lot of the Disneyland Paris Tomorrowland stuff.
Oh, that makes sense because 2000 Leagues
20,000
Yeah.
Leagues.
was used for the submarine.
Hilariously, I was trying to think of Jules Verne's name, and I was like, the guy that Doc Brown in Back to the Future really likes. I couldn't remember Jules Verne.
Yeah.
Yeah. More about the ride. In the ride, you would actually traveled through the Snow Queen's throne room, where you would have encountered many of the characters from the fairy tale as animatronics, which included the Snow Queen.
Oh.
Davis would model the Snow Queen's outfit after Erde design gowns, an outfit that would have been worn by a showgirl in the film Ziegfeld Follies and George White's Scandal. They're kind of like flapper dresses or like formal flapper wear. The project never made it past the concept art phase. I think you can look up some of his concept art for the ride. Around the late 80s, Disney Animation Studios would repeatedly try to make the Snow Queen into a feature-length film, but would repeatedly run into issues and plot holes. For example, when Gerda rescues Kai, she just walks in and saves him. There's no final confrontation or battle with the queen.
You never see the queen at the end. What the hell is that?
No, she like just took him away and then it
And
was...
it vanished.
Yeah.
Just like, here, solve a puzzle, and I'll leave you alone in this room while you solve a puzzle.
He was the only one in the palace. Like, she was this almighty queen and she only kidnapped one boy.
Yeah.
Where if she like kidnapped the children of the town and she was like, I just gonna take this one guy, and she's like, whatever, I have like hundreds of kids that will like bend to my will.
And it's not even like the kids were being told cautionary tales of like, oh, be careful, the Snow Queen's out there. And
Yeah, there's no stranger danger or anything like that.
Yeah, what?
Be aware of beautiful women. Even Harvey Fierstein, he actually pitched his own version of the Snow Queen, but that got rejected.
I would love to see Harvey Fierstein's version of the Snow Queen.
I would too.
Only if he voices the Snow Queen. That's what I want.
Oh, that would be
be the
incredible.
I mean, people think Harvey Fierstein is a famous drag queen, but you're not playing a drag queen in this show.
Absolutely not. And that's that's how started all that talk. But that's what made it easier for me to start it. But once I got into it, no, I could use some of my skills from drag, but I had to approach it the way you approach any other role, from the inside out.
Around the late 90s, supervising animator Glenn Keane spent months trying to figure out a way to adapt the Snow Queen into a feature-length film, only to give up on that concept and focus on another fairy tale, Rapunzel, which would eventually evolve into the film Tangled. Other rejected pitches came from the Brizzy brothers. They are the storyboard artists for A Goofy Movie, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Tarzan, and Fantasia 2000. There was another one from Dick Zondag, who is the supervising animator for Dinosaur, Chicken Little, and Meet the Robinsons.
I know Dick.
Yay.
Not weird.
Have you worked with him, or are you just kind of...
I have. I worked with him. He's really nice.
What did you work with him on?
I worked with him on a projection show that's on in Animal Kingdom.
Oh,
nice.
He directed all the animals animating on the tree. I worked with him on that. He was the director on
Yeah,
that.
I know that. Nice.
It was really interesting. But yeah, he's cool.
And then we had another pitch from Dave Getz, who is the art director of Hunchback of Notre Dame, Atlantis, Meet the Robinson, and Tangled.
Hearing that he was the art designer for those movies, I feel like those are some like really specific looks, especially Atlantis and Hunchback of Notre Dame. That's a good pedigree right there.
I think he worked on Zootopia as well. Let me double check that. Because I did work with him as well.
So something that I will typically do, because most likely he did, I will try and list out any properties that they've worked to prior to.
Yeah. No,
to kind of show you like what their lead up projects were before
Frozen.
Don't time travel, Cara.
I'm sorry. I was just trying to make sure I was remembering that correctly.
Did he work on Zootopia?
He did work on Zootopia.
Ah, okay, yes. To kind of go into where the idea of like Frozen came from, there was the book Disney War by James B. Stewart. He describes a production meeting that he was in with Michael Eisner, David Stanton, Mary Jane Ruggles, Pam Coates, and himself that took place on June 11th, 2003. They were all discussing future feature animated films, which included Frog Princess, Rumpelstiltskin, You Don't Know Jack About the Beanstalk, Hansel and Gretel, with the twist, the kids are obnoxious and the witch is likable. There was Mother Goose and the Snow Queen.
Half of those pitches sound like they came from the Katzenberg era.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Hansel and Gretel, except the kids are assholes, definitely sounds like a Jeffrey Katzenberg story.
I do love You Don't Know Jack About the Beanstalk.
That is hilarious.
Yeah.
In the meeting, they discuss how they can save the Snow Queen, which Eisner mistakenly and ignorantly calls the Ice Queen. For him, the ending felt forced and abrupt, and after reading the original fairy tale, I completely agree with that. Eisner throws out the idea of making a deal with John Lasseter and having Pixar make the film.
Oh, interesting. So this would have been before the buyout.
Yeah, 2003, right?
Yeah.
Yep, 2003.
But also, Pixar hadn't adapted anything up to
they
that
hadn't.
point, right?
Yeah, they thought they were going to bring it to Pixar, but they rejected that idea. Ruggles piped in with the pitch stating, quote, "The Snow Queen is a terrible bitch. When her suitors try to melt her heart, the Snow Queen freezes them. Each one should be a phony, but different." And then Eisner cuts her off to complete the pitch, and he says, quote, "Then comes along a regular guy. This is perfect. The regular guy goes up there. He's not that great, but he's a good person. He starts to unfreeze her. She melts." Ruggles promises to have a treatment within 2 weeks, and then Eisner is overjoyed and asks if they can have the movie by 2006, and Pam Coates immediately says no. And Pam Coates was right, because that did not happen. The closest that we got was an announcement Disney made in March 2006 stating that Alan Menken, the composer behind the Hans Christian Andersen adaptation hit The Little Mermaid, would be creating the stage musical The Snow Queen, set to premiere at Tokyo Disney Sea the next summer.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah. Along with Alan Menken writing and composing the musical would be directed by Amon Miyamoto, story written by John Weidman, and lyrics by Glenn Slater. Just a few months later, in August, Disney announced The Snow Queen was canceled with no explanation why. From a Jim Hill article talking about the failed attempts Disney tried to make The Snow Queen, he states that there were two possible reasons. The first was because the Oriental Land Company were shocked by how much it would cost to shut down their current running show Encore and replace it with the effect-filled stage show. The second theory is that the Oriental Land Company wanted the Snow Queen movie to be produced first before proceeding forward with the stage production. So far, all that had been made, or at least what Menken and Slater had to show for their work in the few months, was a recording of the song Love Can't Be Denied, which was performed by Brian Darcy James.
Love's the only thing, no one is above. I can love that love can't be
Menken and Slater kept going with the production and teamed up with director Mike Gabriel, who directed Pocahontas and Rescuers Down Under, to make an animated version of the Snow Queen. Again, they ran into the same story issues and plot holes prior Disney productions were run into before. All seem hopeless for the Frozen fairy tale. Fast forward to 2008, when John Lasseter hired Chris Buck to work on a new Disney project. Buck left Disney Animation to work for Sony, where he co-directed Surf's Up. Buck had multiple ideas that he pitched to Lasseter, one of which being an adaptation of The Snow Queen. Development had begun for Anna and the Snow Queen, and they were planning on making it in a traditional 2D animated format, like how The Princess and the Frog was produced, which is probably why they brought The Princess and the Frog producer, Peter Del Vecchio. Early on, Josh Gad had been hired to voice a character named Olaf, which in an interview with MSN claims was a very different character, and Megan Mullally was originally going to play Elsa.
That's so wild that Josh Gad was attached as Olaf in this
way back
much
before.
earlier version.
He was just hanging out around Disney Studios, and he's like, what are you guys
Hire
doing? He's
me.
like, I don't know.
Hire me. I can sing.
Which I assumed that they brought over the Lopez's, and then they were the reason that they hired Josh Gad. I'm honestly a little surprised that, because Josh Gad, wasn't a name at that time, really.
No.
Now I wonder if it would the other way around, that they hired Josh Gad and then they were looking for music and he was the one who got the Lopez's, in the project.
Maybe he was doing that thing, that advice that you get from boomers that say, how to get a job? Just hang around that company until they finally hire you. And I think that's what Josh Gad did.
Yeah. For anybody who doesn't know, the Lopez's wrote the music for Book of Mormon, which was the big smash Broadway comedy from the creators of South Park, and Josh Gad was a star there. And that was the breakout hit for both the Lopez's, who've done music for a bunch of stuff, and Josh Gad. Lopez's, who did Frozen, and also went on to do writing every theme song for WandaVision.
Oh, yeah, they did.
Yeah.
The Lopez's also wrote Agatha All Along.
Those were so good, though.
Nice.
Yeah.
Messing up everything.
It's been Agatha all along.
By 2010, the production went into development hell for about a year. This is a quote from Del Vecchio explaining why it was so difficult to make a film based on the Snow Queen. Quote, in that earlier version of his story, the Snow Queen character was really more of a villain, but it was very hard to relate to her, to understand her, and why she was doing what she was doing. She was sort of isolated up there in her castle. Still, the production carried on, and they storyboarded the movie to present to John Lasseter. His notes would prove very useful, and in them, he stated that the story was fun and lighthearted, but the characters didn't resonate, and they weren't multifaceted. It's hard for an audience to connect with them. I didn't find the original script for Frozen, which is usually the case for these animated films, but I was able to kind of piece together what the film might have been like. I did find a podcast that Jennifer Lee was on. She was on an episode of Script Notes where she was talking about the original versions of it. So in the interview, Lee did state that the theme, true love will thaw a frozen heart. And that actually stayed in the story until the final version of the film.
Yeah.
That was the pitch Buck gave to Lasseter, and that's what sold him to greenlighting the movie. Anna and Elsa weren't originally sisters. Like I said before, it was more like the fairy tale. Elsa was set to be the villain, but it was such a difficult character to sympathize with and give motivation to. They just knew that she was evil, and Anna was going to be the one that saved her. There was an explanation as to why Elsa got her powers. It had something to do with planets aligning. It would be explained by a narrating troll with a Brooklyn accent.
I do remember hearing something like about that.
Oh my God.
I don't know why, but I love the Disney trope of anachronistic accents. Danny DeVito showing up in Hercules, love it. Amazing.
The narrator in the beginning of Aladdin that's also trying to sell Tupperware.
Oh, yeah. I mean, really everything about the genie as well, like just being completely anachronistic.
There was one point where the song "Do You Want to Build a Snowman" was cut because it was too sad.
It does get sad.
But it's the best part of the movie.
It's true. It's true. That's why it's so good, though, because it gets so sad.
I wonder if it's like, oh, we got to cut this song. Up comes out. Just kidding. Don't cut out the sad beginning. Sad beginning is the best thing you can do.
For a moment after the parents die, there was going to be a regent that filled in for the king and queen to rule until Elsa was of age to rule herself.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer Lee wanted the character to be played by Louis C.K. Now, keep in mind, this interview was taking place in 2014, and the production was in 2012.
Yep.
There was a moment in the second act that was about Anna trying to get to Hans and trying to kiss him, with Elsa trying to stop her. There was a song that was cut called Life's Too Short, which was going to be sung by Anna and Elsa. Elsa is in prison and Anna is in her room alone. The song would have reconnected the sisters and gave away the ending and even ended the movie right there.
So during the course of this, they're starting to realize Elsa was too much of a villain. Let's try to give it more reason to the story. Let's make her sisters with the hero. And now it seems like they're slowly but surely saying okay, we're going to find a way to redeem Elsa. She's going to become a villain and then be redeemed. And that's the direction that the story is going to need to go in.
Yes.
For a long time, it was going to be like a love story. It was going to be Anna, and I assume it was Christoph. I don't remember if his name was still Christoph, but it was originally going to be this is hearsay because I wasn't on it at the time that this was all happening.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to give Elsa the Snow Queen angle of she had been in love and then was jilted at the altar. And so then she was fuck that, fuck love. And so that's why she was full Snow Queen, and that made her more sympathetic. And I guess something must have happened in there that didn't carry. And I know at some point Christoph was an assassin kind of deal.
Oh.
He was hired by Hans to go kill Elsa.
Oh, interesting.
To end the never-ending winter.
Yeah.
Huh.
That was a story idea for a little while.
I mean, that's actually kind of a cool idea that could have been in the version of the movie we saw. Because honestly, there's not too much of a reason for Christoph to be there otherwise. It makes sense that was an idea because that is a reason why Christoph is part of this journey other than he happened to be the guy that Anna ran into and needed a ride from. That's kind of a cool idea. I could see why they didn't go with it, especially because it would have muddied things up a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the other note that they ran into was that it made him too Flynn Rider, and they didn't want to have another Flynn Rider.
Makes sense.
That's why they didn't go with that. And I remember that the sisters idea only came in because in interviews, they always say somebody in the story room brought up the idea that they should be sisters.
Yeah.
And I believe it was the story supervisor who brought it up.
Okay.
Who's the story supervisor?
Oh, God. I can't remember her name right now. Which is hilarious because I saw her all the time. I can't remember her name right now. It was one of those things where they always said someone in the room, but she knew it was her. And so she would always get really upset about it. She was I did, but they don't want to say that the supervisor brought the idea up. They want to attribute it to a creative, which I guess is fair, but she was always very it was me. This poor girl.
Is it Jessica Julius?
Yes.
Oh.
You looked up the story credits.
Yep.
All right.
In meetings like that, everybody's allowed to talk and pitch in.
Yeah.
They may genuinely have forgotten that it was her.
Yeah.
Because at the time, they may not have had very good note tracking for who was bringing up what ideas.
Well, it's also part of the collaborative nature of storytelling, especially in animation. Animation, I feel more than a lot of other things, tends to have a lot of different people giving a lot of different ideas.
These meetings get huge depending on what they're trying to solve in the story. They'll bring in every director team into a meeting that will go for 12 hours.
Wow.
I've been in that meeting and I've taken verbatim notes in those meetings. It's not fun. They may genuinely have just forgotten it was her because that kind of thing gets so muddy. And especially when they start working it for so long and this is their life, this is their everyday for 3 to 4 years, they may genuinely have forgotten.
Yeah.
But she was always kind of I remember that it was me.
You heard it here first. You can change the wiki.
Don't change the wiki. I'm scared.
Don't worry, we have an army to do that.
Oh, shit.
I actually don't know if that's actually a thing. If you've changed the wiki because of our podcast, please let us know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, man, I'd be really scared to find out that, like, our podcast was in the footnotes of a wiki article.
Oh, God.
That would sound
my God.
really scary.
Terrifying.
Thankfully, we try to do our best to find firsthand sources and do lots of research. This specific thing, though, we'll also say is based off of one person trying to remember a name and saying, I'm pretty sure this person was the one who always said it was her. So I don't know if that's going to be enough evidence for a wiki article, guys, but...
You know what? That's true. That is so valid. I could be misremembering, but like, because I even remember Jennifer Lee Mon. She was probably like in a meeting like right after it had been brought up. She was like, oh yeah, somebody was like, we should make them sisters. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And like now everything makes a lot more sense. And I was like,
yeah,
cool. We're talking about Frozen in a Moana meeting. So I was kind of like half paying attention at that point, but I'm like, that's not my project. How dare you?
Let's see, other original ideas. Originally, Anna and Elsa were not royalty. The decision to make that change was to increase the stakes.
To increase the stakes or to increase the merchandising opportunities.
Yeah. One of the original endings, Elsa was still evil. She kidnaps Anna for her own wedding, freezes her heart, and then attacks the town with her army of snowmen. That movie I do want to see.
That's a cool ending.
Yeah. Prince Hans wasn't even included in the original draft and was later added as the twist villain.
I remember when that happened too. That was crazy.
When did that happen?
Do you have anything that you can remember about that?
I remember I saw my supervisor. My development supervisor was talking to somebody else who must have been in a supervisor position on Frozen. I know it wasn't the story supervisor, but they were talking about like, oh, we've just added this new change to the movie. And we decided we have this character who's sort of like a love interest, but like also he's sort of the villain. I don't remember. He was one or the other initially. And then they decided like, why don't we just make him one and then reveal it?
Why not both?
Yeah, in the middle. And I remember my supervisor and me both going like, oh, that's fucked up. That's great.
And it's such a good twist.
This is how I want to imagine that idea came about and that decision was made. What I would love for the story to be is that they were like, okay, we're writing this story, and every time we talk about this, we're realizing more and more that Elsa's not the bad guy. We need a different bad guy. And part of that realization is like, okay, let's go back to the source material. Let's go back to the life of Hans Christian Andersen. And you know what? This guy wrote this whole thing where he turned his love interest who jilted him into the villain, and that's messed up. She's not the villain in that story. He's the villain. So let's not make the Snow Queen the villain anymore. We're going to put a new villain in here, and we're going to name him Hans. Because fuck you, Hans Christian Andersen, you incel asswipe. That's how I wish that decision was made.
Yeah, and I mean, I wasn't in that meeting, but I totally love thinking that that's what happened.
If you go back to what made Frozen such a phenomenon, not only is it kind of meta-referencing Disney tropes, but it's specifically also part of this cultural realization that has become much more mainstream over the last 15 years. The idea that, hey, the stalker dude love story is actually really creepy and messed up. And we've been able to create stories that are much more giving the female character's agency in a way that did not exist even a few years prior to that. We had 500 Days of Summer coming out in the late aughts, and we're only in this era of realizing like the problems with that kind of story. And so it really feels like Frozen was written as a response to that, and also is responding to the original Snow Queen, and certainly is a part of this narrative trend of the evil woman who is just rejecting the nice guy.
She just needs to find the right guy.
Yeah. And how Frozen is like unabashedly against that idea and proposing an alternative to that idea, an alternative to that style of love story. It feels so obvious to me now that they named the villain Hans. It makes the whole thing make sense.
That reminded me of the Onion article that's titled "Romantic Comedy Behavior Gets Real Life Man Arrested."
Yes, 100%. 100%. I want to rewatch Frozen now. Now that I know the story of Hans Christian Andersen, it is like so much more fascinating to me if I think about this as a direct response to Hans Christian Andersen. Like, I hope he's rolling in his grave and realizing what happened here.
We've taken your story about you being jilted by a girl you were liked and made it a big fuck you to you.
Yeah.
Another original idea was that at first Anna was supposed to flirt with Kristoff, but Disney studio chairman Alan Horn pointed out that this might confuse audiences since she got engaged to Hans in the first act.
That's true. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That'd be weird. Anna's very thirsty though. Like, damn. She's the thirstiest Disney princess in any of the movies.
This is awkward. Not you're awkward, but just because I'm awkward. You're gorgeous. Wait, what?
I did find some concept art that may help give an idea of the original 2D animated version. If you Google search Claire Keane Frozen or Snow Queen concept art, you can find it.
Or if you follow How Did This Not Get Made on Twitter or Instagram, I'm sure Dan will end up posting it in those social media posts as well.
I definitely will.
Yeah. Claire Keane, daughter of Glenn Keane.
Oh.
She also worked on Tangled. So you might see some of her work mixed in there.
So you can see the different art style that they were going for. The best way to describe it is that if the Snow Queen looked more like Yzma from Emperor's New Groove, but was young and had icy blue skin and a soft, snowy gown and a snowflake tiara, Keane inspired her looks off of Bette Midler and Amy Winehouse. In the original version, Elsa was supposed to be much older than Anna.
I'm looking at this art right now, and it's interesting how the design of Anna did not change at all. The hair, the dress, it is exactly the same as what we get. The proportions are different, but other than that, it is the exact same look as we get in the movie.
Yeah, sometimes that kind of thing will stick, because sometimes the main character will go through a million iterations of designs, and sometimes they'll find it early on and then it just sticks.
Yeah.
It's like when you see the audition tape of Indiana Jones, Tom Selleck.
Tom Selleck?
Yeah, so...
Yeah, he was originally cast as Indiana Jones.
I had no idea. That's awesome.
Which is why the Chippendale Rescue Rangers are designed the way they are. One is based off of Tom Selleck and the other one's based off of Indiana Jones.
That's amazing.
But if you watch the audition tape of Tom Selleck as Indiana Jones, you'll see like they basically took the costume and just put it on him. So they figured out the costume long before they figured out who was going to play Indy.
Look, I did what I did. I don't expect you to be happy about it. But maybe it can do us both some good.
Why start
Just
now?
shut up. Shut up and listen to me. Now I need that piece your father had.
On December 22nd, 2011, Disney announced that their new film Frozen would be released on November 27th, 2013. With the success of Tangled, they also announced a month later that it would be a computer animated feature, scrapping the 2D animation production.
Which is a real bummer that Disney stopped doing 2D animation. There's lots of thoughts and opinions. I never really realized until now, though, that yes, it was the fact that Princess and the Frog was not very financially successful.
Yep.
But it's also because Tangled was really, really successful, which makes me feel a little bad for liking Tangled so much.
I know. The original Snow Queen, as it was, got shelved when Princess and the Frog didn't do well. Tangled was too far along in production to cancel it. And they were like, clearly princess movies are not selling. Destroy the princess movies. So they shelved Snow Queen. Tangled was too far along. So like, release Tangled.
Yeah.
Tangled came out, did extremely well. And they're like, well, let's take a look at Frozen again.
And then they were like, oh, the problem wasn't princesses. The problem was 3D animation.
Also racism, but you know. Well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm disappointed about the death of 2D animation at Disney.
Yeah.
But I will say for Frozen specifically, I am glad that Tangled's success helped make Frozen to be the way it was.
Yeah.
With one exception. There's one thing that I hate about Tangled, and that I also hate that it clearly is the reason for the same thing in Frozen, which is the title. I hate that title. It's terrible. I don't like it being called Tangled. Don't like it being called Frozen. It's stupid.
I get why Frozen is called Frozen, especially after hearing the original Snow Queen story. It is so far removed from the Snow Queen that it would not make any sense to call it the Snow Queen.
That makes sense.
Calling it the Snow Queen as well, I feel like would also put you against Elsa, like before you even start watching the movie.
Yeah, very quickly. Even if you haven't heard the story, you have kind of the idea of what a Snow Queen or what an Ice Queen is.
Yeah.
It puts something in your head that would not be fun going into the movie because it's very different. I think that was a similar thought process for Tangled, in that it wasn't just Rapunzel's story, it was also Flynn's.
Yeah, but it's Rapunzel's story.
I agree with you.
At least in Frozen, it's about things being frozen and hearts being frozen. Nothing in Tangled is getting tangled.
Yeah, her hair never gets tangled, which is a fucking miracle. How long her hair is. My hair gets tangled. It's short as hell. At least a bunch of the people I worked with at Disney were all like, I hate that it's called Frozen. And so we had this kind of running joke when John Lasseter would go through and like look at all the movies that were like slated and like starting to get greenlit for everything. We started making a joke like, okay, so there's Frozen, and now he's going into the next adjective movie, which I think at the time was Big Hero 6, but we were like, Rescued, and then he's going to go into Moana, it's going to be called Thawed. And then,
I'm glad that trend stopped after 2 movies.
I'm glad too. It was ridiculous. I didn't like it. I remember my sister being like, hey, because she was there when Tangled was being made, and she was like, hey, what do you think of a movie with a trailer that looks like this? And I think she was describing like Flynn climbing the tower, and she's like, and then the movie's called Tangled. And I'm like, I don't get it. It's like, why is it called Tangled? I don't get it.
That's like one of the things that makes the movies feel dated. That is such a of its time style of title. It does not have a timeless quality to it.
Yeah.
So in January 2012, Kristen Anderson-Lopez and Robert Lopez, who wrote the music for not only the Book of Mormon, like we mentioned before, but also Avenue Q.
Yeah,
that's right. Love Avenue Q.
They were hired to write the music for Frozen. I didn't realize how late in the game that they were involved. They finally figured it out, kind of, and then they were just like, all right, now we bring in the songwriters. We're not going to do the Aladdin thing again, where we write the music first and realize that Proud of Our Boy is not a good song, and then we're just going to cut it out. They were trying to keep in Alan Menken's song, the Love Can't Be Denied. They were going to put that into the feature film, but because of the drastic changes to the script, it was no longer relevant to the story. And he finally left the production.
I love how Alan Menken started doing weird, irreverent comedy on Broadway and like got success with Little Shop of Horrors and then becomes the Disney guy forever. I feel like executives were like, okay, we got to find the next Alan Menken. Let's look at what's the weird, irreverent stuff happening on Broadway right now, and let's hire those guys.
I do remember being like, the Avenue Q people? Really? But yeah, they came on pretty late, and a lot of those songs came in real late. It was fascinating. I'm like, good luck, production. Good job. You can do this.
So then in March 2012, Jennifer Lee, who was previously working on Wreck-It Ralph, she was brought on as just a writer. So at Disney Animation, when a film is in development, they have a screening of the film every 12 weeks, where all the writers, directors, and other creatives would come in and watch the film and give notes to help improve the story. For Lee, she was working on Wreck-It Ralph, and she was invited to the early versions of Frozen, and she gave her notes. She was also getting notes from the Frozen crew while she was working on Wreck-It Ralph. When she joined, she was already familiar with the story and the characters. In a funny side story, when Lee was giving notes for Frozen, she did not like the character Olaf and had written something along the lines of, quote, "Kill the fucking snowman. I hate him.
The every 12 weeks there's a screening. Yeah, that is true.
Okay. Yeah, when she wrote the note about the snowman, this is, I guess, before Josh Gad had been like hanging around or got cast into the movie. It was also before they changed the character to be more lovable and funny. The original character was half good and half evil and could be mean at times. With Jennifer Lee, Kristen Anderson-Lopez, and Robert Lopez all joining at the same time, much of the script was being rewritten with the music written alongside it. On top of that, the animation style was going to be changed. So basically, they were starting over and had 17 months to get it done.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh boy.
That is when I started at Disney. It's March 2012.
Oh, wow. So everything's on fire. Everyone's panicking.
Everything was on fire. All I ever knew about Frozen while I was there was everything's on fire. Get this beast done. They're like, just get it done. We'll never think about it again.
Amazing. Jennifer Lee and Chris Buck drew influences from several resources. They had the art department visit Norway to create a look based on their culture and environment. They also looked to Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, and several Miyazaki films that gave a sense of a, quote, epic adventure and a big scope and scale, and then intimacy of funny, quirky characters. In August 2012, Jennifer Lee was promoted to co-director by John Lasseter and Edwin Catmull. Much of the reason is because she and Chris Buck had very similar ideas as to how the story should be told, and again, they were in a time crunch. Buck took over for a lot of the animation directing, while Lee would take over the story and scripting. Buck and his crew had to go back to the drawing board. All they had really were the characters Anna, who was supposed to be Gerda, the Snow Queen, which was Elsa, and Kristoff taking the character Kai. It was one of the brainstorming mentioned. Oh yeah, we'd mentioned this before. The brainstorming meeting where someone stated, what if Elsa and Anna were sisters? Who is that again?
Allegedly, it was Jessica Julius.
Jessica Julius is the one that said that Anna and Elsa should be sisters. So immediately the story started to click and the story pieces started to snap in place. Again, from Del Vecchio, quote, once we realized that these characters would be siblings and have a relationship, everything changed. I mean, you may not always like what Elsa does or the choices that she makes, but given that she could now have a real emotion connected with Anna, and these two characters, now that they were sisters, would obviously have some history. Well, you could now at least understand the whys behind the story. John Lasseter saw the changes and knew that this would work. He also put together a sister summit where women who grew up with sisters from the Disney Animation Studios would convene and tell stories about the relationships with their sisters. Did you attend the Sister Summit?
I did not, but I remember the call going out and I remember wanting to. But I think I just had a schedule conflict, so I couldn't.
That's a strange name.
Yep.
They do that a lot. Whenever it's something like that, they call it a summit. I know Flynn had like a handsome man summit.
Handsome man summit.
Yeah, they got like a bunch of the women in the studio to come in and be like, all right, who are the best looking guys in your opinion? What makes a guy attractive? And they built Flynn out of that meeting.
That's pretty great. I kind of like that.
Sense.
But yeah, that happens a lot. I don't know why it's called a summit, but they always call it that.
So a major breakthrough in the development was the song Let It Go. Lee admits in the interview with script notes that the song was the perfect embodiment of what the character needed.
Yeah.
It was the characterization that the writers just couldn't crack. The lyrics, which weren't changed much from the demo, turned Elsa from a cold-hearted villain to a sympathetic character who is scared and struggles to control her powers.
Makes sense.
And then in my last note, which I cannot confirm, but there are a lot of fans that have pointed out that the character names Hans, Kristoff, Anna, and Sven loosely make the name Hans Christian Andersen. It might be a coincidence, and no one who worked on the movie has confirmed this connection.
Well, we all know that the villain is called Hans because Hans Christian Andersen is a villain.
The
rest of it, I will see, but...
I cannot confirm or deny. I have no idea. Like, Hans definitely feels like it was on purpose. Kristoff, Anna, Sven, I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the story of Frozen about the Snow Queen and the insufferable Hans Christian Andersen.
The stories behind Disney films are always really interesting because of how long of development most of these movies have and how many different versions there are.
Yeah.
And I think with like Frozen specifically, because of how much the movie is in conversation with themes of Disney movies, themes of romantic comedies, themes of these types of fairy tales, like, I think it makes it especially interesting to know that the idea had been sitting on Disney's shelf for years. I mean, practically a century if you want to track it all the way back to the Metro-Goldwyn project. It's really cool to kind of see how it only came around when our culture was starting to have a different realization of how to approach these kinds of stories.
Yeah. It's super interesting. Animation is always an extremely long process.
Yeah.
Your average person doesn't always know that. It takes like 4 to 5 years for something to begin as like a kernel in their brain to being released in theaters. I think I was told that this was John Lasseter who said it, was that with animation, the movie's never done. It just gets released.
Ah, that makes sense.
That's an old quote that's been around for a while of like, movies are never finished, they escape.
Because otherwise they'll just spin on their wheels and trying to make it better and better and better until somebody stops them.
We are losing so much money. We're just hemorrhaging thousands of dollars a day.
That is the producer's job.
Okay, I'm trying to find the source of that quote.
Who originally says it?
Well, I don't know if this is who originally says it, but everything I'm finding about it is a featurette of Ben Burt talking about doing sound design for Attack of the Clones. And the featurette is called Films Are Not Released, They Escape.
Oh.
So that's the only source I'm finding about that quote.
Yeah, the first place I heard it was an executive producer said it in a meeting that I was in, and I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, especially in technical films, and especially with animation. It's so true that can be the case.
It can very quickly get away from you. It's hard, and like with Frozen especially.
Yeah. I mean, look at Thief and the Cobbler.
Yes.
Oh my God, yeah, that took so long for that movie to get done.
And it never really did get done.
No.
Yeah, and it was just released.
Frozen went on a journey, man.
Yeah. I feel like Disney generally has such a long-term view of their projects and their plans. It feels like so many other studios are thinking like 2 or 3 years ahead, where Disney thinks 10 years ahead of trying to make everything happen.
Yeah. At least when I was there, and I'm sure this is still true, there would be like 5 or 6 movies in development vying for the next spot. And so it gets super competitive too. And so it can be really hard on the directors as well, because some directors will be sitting there on their ideas for years and years.
Yeah.
It can be really, really stressful and really, really disheartening for some of them.
Yeah. It's amazing that Ron and John kept with Disney after them not being able to make their favorite movie for 15 years. Which is still my favorite Disney movie. I love Treasure Planet. I don't care what anybody says.
Treasure Planet is so good. There's so many Disney movies. I'm like, I don't understand where the hate for this comes from, because Black Cauldron's great. Treasure Planet is great. They're so quick to just be like, it was all right. I'm like, it's a great movie. You're just upset because you didn't actually see it. Go watch Meet the Robinsons, everybody. It's so good.
I rewatched Meet the Robinsons recently, and it's a wonderful movie.
It's so good.
And
it's
Chicken
so,
Little
so
is... Oh, wait, no. Everybody hates Chicken Little. That's fine. You can hate that one. Well, I think that's going to go ahead and bring us to the end of this episode. Cara, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us.
Yeah.
If people want to find more of your work and support what you've got going on online, where can they find all of that?
Oh boy. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Hikaranko, which is HIKARANKO. I also have a little Etsy shop called Art Over Flowers. I do lots of fan art stuff and sell them at conventions and online. And if you find me on Twitch, it's also at Hikaranko, HIKARANKO. Yeah.
And if you want to find more about this podcast, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcasts.com, which is also the home of Come On Fahuguapods, Escape from Walt Disney, and Pod Made You Special, a VeggieTales rewatch podcast. While you're there, you can also find links to our social media pages. We are on Twitter at HDTNGM. We're on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made. Both of those are really, really fun follows because Dan, every time we put out a new episode, episode, you can expect daily posts, often multiple posts a day with concept art or other images that have to do with what we talked about, going over the whole arc of the story in the episode. So it is a really excellent visual companion to the podcast. Mm-hmm. You can also send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com. Send us any corrections, any additions, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, at that website, pipedreampodcast.com, you can also find a link to our Patreon page where you get ad-free versions of this podcast as well as our other shows, Come On Fahuwa Pods and Pod Made You Special, as well as tons of other awesome bonus things. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, for having me. I would love to come back.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.